for littles, especially medically complex kiddos, I still think that it's so important for us to focus on some of those developmental movement patterns because they're just really good for the body, even if we need support to do them. So things like rolling, for example, rolling is interconnected with tummy time. Tummy time is essential for building shoulder strength, upper trunk.
Welcome to Complex Conversations, brought to you by the Blue Bee Collective. I'm your host, Chasity Short, and I'm so glad you're here. Complex Conversations in the Blue Bee Collective exist to provide education, advocacy, and empowerment to families living lives with medically complex kids. We bring together families with complex care providers to help build up a fierce and empowered complex community. Today, we are joined by Dr. Lauren Baker, who's a pediatric physical therapist, an author of 4 books, and a developmental expert, to talk about the art of meeting your child where they are. Dr. Lauren also will be talking about the magic of breaking down movement into small, attainable micro goals. So we're so glad you're here, and remember, if you're here, you belong. Lauren, thanks so much for joining us. I'm so happy to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we've been talking on Instagram for months now, so I feel like I know you, even though we've actually never met in person and never talked in person until now, so, or kind of virtually in person. So thanks for coming on. You have so much to share, and I'm excited for our audience to hear what you have to say. So you are a pediatric physical therapist, a developmental expert, and a military spouse. Is that right?
It is, yeah.
Oh, and you're an author, a published author of, how many books do you have? 3 or 4?
So 3 like educational books, and then I also have a children's book.
Which is super cool. I'm actually in my process of writing my book, mostly in part because of you. I mean, I had the book in my head, but I didn't actually think I could write a book. And you're solely responsible for giving me the belief that I could do it. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Yeah, I love writing books, honestly. I feel like it's just a way to get information out to parents and people who need it, especially in the international community where maybe they might not have access to like online courses or some of that more in-depth information, but they do have access to Amazon. And what's fun about self-publishing on Amazon is that Amazon makes those books really relevant from a cost perspective to those families there with like the exchange rate and things like that. So it does feel like it's more accessible to worldwide individuals, which is a huge passion of mine.
Yeah, and you were telling me that you went on an overseas trip, right, to work with kiddos who don't have access to therapists, and maybe that was your YouTube video. Anyway, I felt like it was you. And so you wrote this book almost as like a really in-depth home exercise program for these families to be able to carry out. Is that, am I getting it right?
Yeah. So we went to, me and a friend who was a fellow military spouse, we went to Nepal. We had worked together in North Carolina outside of Camp Lejeune, and we decided like it really felt like something on our hearts to go somewhere. And we were like, we kind of gave ourselves space and stillness to kind of feel like, hey, where do we feel called to go? And Nepal kept coming up. And it was really interesting for us because neither of us had been, no other ties there. And we really didn't fully understand why we felt called to go all the way on the other side of the world. We kept coming up and like, what about Arizona? What about places closer to home that we could help? And we just couldn't shake Nepal. And so in 2016, we did a 2-week mission trip over there to work with kiddos with special needs in Nepal, they don't have integrated schools. And so they actually would live at the school Monday through Friday, and then they would go home with their families on the weekend. Now, that seems a little bit intense, but in Nepal, they have a lot of different festivals. And so during festival weeks, which seems to be like every other week, truthfully, the families would come bring them home during those times too. So while we were there, we met all of these beautiful, amazing kiddos who worked so hard. And while right before we left, we were like, we can't just go there, show up, help, and then leave. And so we were like, what could we do? So in 30 days, we were like, we could write a book. And
I
we did.
know.
We wrote.
Just write a book.
It'll be fine. It'll all work out. So we did. And our first book was actually printed at Staples and like spiral bound. And we brought that over with us. But it basically had just very simple exercises. We hadn't met these kids yet. And so we took some liberties and we tried to have some really simple kind of body position exercises. And then we brought some equipment over, nothing that had batteries, nothing like that. And it all fit into a duffel bag. And then we left that equipment with them. And then some of the exercises were based on the equipment that we brought. And so after that experience, which was absolutely incredible, we ended up publishing that book on Amazon in 2020. And so that was my first book. We co-authored, we went through the experience together. And then since then, I've become a little bit more brave and done a couple more on my own, including that children's book, which I had someone illustrate, which was just a fun experience too. And my latest book came out in October 3rd. So
That's awesome. And I'm going to link all those books in the bio too, because I want everyone to check them out. So one of the things I love so much about that story is you empowering the families that I feel like a lot of times in healthcare workers, so I'm included in that, we kind of can come in like this savior mentality. Like, I'm here with the secret knowledge that I'm going to now save you from whatever problem you have. And I love when I meet people who are like, okay, I did get all this knowledge from all this schooling and all this, but I'm going to empower you with it so that you can help take control of your situation. You can, you're not just waiting for someone else to save you. So I love that you did that so much.
Yeah. And it was really, really important for us not to do that and to really go and learn about the culture and really kind of try to figure out how we could use even like the things that they had already at the school. And even simple things like we had a kiddo who was really struggling. He was an older kiddo and he was really struggling with standing, and through just kind of working with him and listening to the staff, thankfully in Nepal, a lot of individuals speak English, which was a huge help for us. So we didn't have to deal with the language barrier quite as much. Not everyone spoke English, but enough that we were able to really closely interact with the staff. But this little kiddo actually felt like he was avoiding weight bearing more due to some sensory concerns. And so we while we're PTs and that's not necessarily our huge scope of expertise, we knew enough about sensory that we felt like we could introduce a couple of different things to him. And so we went to the Nepalese grocery store and we bought some beans and made a bean bin for the school. We actually bought a vest at a store and sewed some beans in to make it a little bit of a modified kind of weighted vest for this kiddo. And it really helped then the staff because he was bigger and he was a little bit of an older kid, kind of around that 6-7 age range. And that was actually something that was kind of heartbreaking with these kiddos is not all of the kiddos, they knew how old they were because some kiddos were left with caregivers or were actually one of the kiddos was heartbreakingly left on the side of the road. And
Mm.
so they were able to rescue him, and he actually stayed like at the facility full time with the owner. Um, but so they didn't always know how old these kiddos were, but it was harder for him for the staff to get him into standing because he was so resistant to putting his feet on the ground. With some of these just simple introductions and sharing of techniques, the staff was so grateful because you could tell that he was just getting more curious, right, about these different sensations that were being put on his feet. And so instead of fully relying on these big braces that they had for him, we were able to start introducing and kind of build that bridge so that he was curious about that next stage versus just so fearful about it. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that's super, super important to me, which is yes, we have big dreams for these kiddos, for all kiddos. We have big, big dreams, movement dreams, life dreams, big dreams for these kiddos. But it's so, so important that we meet them where they're comfortable right now. And so,
Yeah.
how do we just look at that next baby step? Because if we try to introduce something that's too big of a gap, they're like staring into the crevice of the Grand Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
And like
That's one
they're
of the
like,
things
no,
I love so much
that's
about.
scary. No
Yeah,
thanks.
no, I can't leap over the Grand Canyon, but if you break it down into 100 steps, maybe I can take that first step. That's one of the things I like so much about your approach is how you break these things down that can feel insurmountable. And one of the things that, you've talked about is even for families that have kiddos that aren't typically developing, um, like I think my son sat up for the first time, he was like 6 or something, like, so if I'm working on this goal and I'm like, we're still working on head control, he's 4 years old. Like, I'm not even going to try to conquer that because that's way too much. And I feel so overwhelmed.
Mhm.
So being able to break that down, can you talk a little bit about kind of your approach and how you break down these tasks into attainable micro tasks?
Yeah. So I think you brought up a couple of really good points, right? Which is parent overwhelm. And we have to be, as providers, so compassionate to their experience because there's absolutely no way, unless we have a similar lived experience, that we can fully grasp everything that they are thinking about doing daily, trying to juggle. And so I'm always really honest with my families. And I always say I try to focus on 3 exercises or 20 minutes a day of therapy from like a home exercise standpoint. But if that is too much, that's okay. Let's focus on one thing until you feel like that thing is so embedded in your natural daily life ability that then you can add something else to your plate. Because if a family is literally only working on one exercise, but they work on it every day versus like feeling every day that like 3 exercises is just so overwhelming, they don't feel comfortable being able to do even one, you're still going to make so much more progress just focusing on that one thing. And I always like to talk about it as like compound interest. So it's the same philosophy with therapy, is just a little bitty, almost completely invisible gains that are happening that over time build on each other so that you can eventually get some of those more noticeable, bigger steps. So that would be kind of the first thing. And
Well, and
then,
I want to
yeah,
talk
go
about
ahead.
that just a little bit because I think that, we go to school, we're kind of taught how to make a home exercise program, or you go to your clinicals and you're kind of taught. And I used to make these home exercise programs that were like 2 pages long. And I would give them to these
I know.
families, and then they would come in, and every single week it was a failure in their
Mhm.
eyes. I didn't do it. I just didn't have time to do it. And I mean, if I'm being honest, for a while, I was like, well, do you take this serious or not? And then I
Yeah.
had my
Yeah.
son, Dominic, who has special needs. And I was like, oh, crap. No wonder no one's done their exercises. And And so at that point, I stopped prescribing home exercise. And then I had to like come back to like, okay, tell me what you can handle. You know, if let's just work on, you know, these two things or whatever. But I think your approach is so much better of we're going to take the micro thing because I don't want to set you as a parent up. No, nobody wants to feel like a failure. You already feel like most parents, regardless if their kids are typically developing or not, in some way feel like they're failing, right? The bathroom's too
Mhm.
dirty, or I didn't cook a nutritious dinner, whatever it is. And so just like not even giving them the option to feel like a failure, just starting from the gate. Like, here's the micro task that we're going to work on. And then once, like you just said, once that is second nature, I'm going to add another micro task so that you never get into that pattern of feeling like you're failing at this. That's
Yeah.
so amazing. I want everyone to hear that.
Well,
Rewind
and
it, listen to it
honestly,
again.
so my path was a little bit different than I feel like some pediatric physical therapists paths are. Like some pediatric physical therapists like know from day one, like in PT school, like I'm only going to work with peds. And like that was, so I went to school with our friend Hope, who's part of kind of the same group of peds PTs that me and Chastity are. Um, and she knew from day one, she was like peds 100% all the way. Like no change. And I had more of a sports medicine background. And so I started in outpatient ortho. And for individuals that don't know, like if you are an adult and you have an injury, that's the type of clinic that you would go to. Well, I would do the same thing, like page like 6, 7, 8 exercises, like, and it was like consistent difficulty doing any of them, right? Like you would
Mm-hmm.
have like one magical patient who would actually complete the thing. And
Yeah.
I am totally guilty of the same thing. Until then, I went to pelvic floor PT myself and then also had a shoulder injury. And consistently, no, I was like, I kept saying, like, nope, this is too fast. I want to go slower. I'm like, like I can only handle 3 things. And some days I can't even handle those 3 things. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
like a, neurotypical adult with just like a military husband and a full-time job and like no kiddos or pets or anything like
Well,
that.
like this is what you
And
do
that
for a job.
still,
So you
right.
know the
And
importance
yeah,
and still
and it
couldn't
was
do it. Yeah.
just like, because even truly, like 3 exercises still takes 15 to 20 minutes, right? And if I
Mm-hmm.
want to do those 3 exercises a couple of times, we're getting close to that 30-minute block, which I feel like is a reasonable amount of time for people to intentionally focus on a good day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, it like wiped everything clean. And I was like, oh my God, I'm not like, this is my baseline. I will on occasion give families, like, especially if they've had the same 3 exercises for a little bit, like a couple weeks or whatnot, I will give them some bonus exercises but usually that's still kind of capped at 5. I'm like, ooh, wrong way. Um, so that way families who want to do more can do more.
Mm-hmm.
And
But
usually
it's a
those are my,
bonus.
but it's a bonus. You get extra
Yeah.
credit points. So, yeah, but I honestly see really great results with that because you can build confidence. You can build that skill. Like we forget sometimes how natural it is for us as therapists to move a baby or a child, to grade movement. So to start slow and move fluidly through like a range or into a position. And most individuals don't have that experience for us. So even making sure as the therapist that you give parents time to practice in this session, which I'm even guilty of. I'm having so much fun working with the kid, working with the baby, that sometimes I'm like, oh shoot, we got to stop what we're doing to talk
Yeah.
about like your skills too, right? Like I want you to, if you don't want to practice with me, that's also fine. Like that's totally your choice. But if you want some feedback on where your hand placement is, a lot of times it's not that parents are doing it wrong necessarily. It's that if they switch their hand position, it could be easier. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what I always try to tell my families is like, it might get smoother if we work on it together, not here. I'm going to sit here and critique your ability to perform an exercise, right? Because no one wants to do that. Would be terrible. That would be so
Right.
not fun.
Yeah, not fun. Can you talk a little bit about kind of relating how you break down, like you have a whole book on rolling, an
Yes.
entire book. I was talking to my husband last night and I was telling him about you and about how you've, made me believe that I can write this book, which all the words are down on paper now. Now I'm just editing.
I'm
But
so proud of you.
thanks.
Amazing.
Well, to be fair, they were already written. I just copy and pasted them. So if anyone's like, "What? You did that so fast?" No, they were already written. I just had to copy them. Anyway, yeah, I think you have a whole book on rolling. So I was telling my husband, I'm like, I feel like I would run out of information, but you're able to see these tasks, which seem simple to a lot of people, but really they're not, and break them down into these tiny tidbits. Can you relate that a little bit to the medically complex kiddo or the kiddo who's, a little bit not up with his peers developmentally, and how looking at those milestones kind of in 100 little pieces can eventually get them there, I don't know, not faster, but just like more efficiently without people losing hope?
Yeah. So there's a couple things. We already talked about the Grand Canyon analogy is especially with a kiddo with developmental delay or another complex medical diagnosis, they may have had such a tough early life, right? A lot of babies, especially if they're diagnosed from birth or have a traumatic birth history or have a genetic condition that takes a while to fully diagnose, but there are medical concerns in the meantime, right? There's
Mhm.
hospitalizations, there's surgeries, there's all of these things. Their early years and experiences are not the same as a baby who has a normal birth and is able to go home right away and all of those things. So what I like to tell families is that, hey, like it's okay for us to honor their experience, right? Like rolling is important, but it's not more important than their ability to breathe or eat or these basic physiological functions that they need to survive. Survival, more important, always 100% of the time than gross motor. But
Mhm.
there will be a certain point at which this stabilizes forever for a period, at which point then we can start to spend more time over in the gross motor phase because we're able to like take a break from the medical considerations. Now, that doesn't mean that kiddos who are in a really stressful, medically complex medical season don't need like movement and motor and things like that. It just might look a little bit different. It might be a little bit more about maintaining their status that they're at right now. So that's a conversation that I always like to have with parents, right? Is like, it's okay that we prioritize other things than progressing in movement milestones at certain stages. Now, as kiddos get bigger, if we didn't build the strength for super valid reasons or for lack of knowledge or, lack of resources, things like that, it does get a little bit harder to move and to go to that next phase once we're bigger because we get more our mass gets bigger, so it requires more strength, and if we didn't have the strength to do it when we were an infant, then as we get older, that does impact things. But for littles, especially medically complex kiddos, I still think that it's so important for us to focus on some of those developmental movement patterns because they're just really good for the body, even if we need support to do them. So things like rolling, for example. Rolling is interconnected with tummy time. Tummy time is essential for building shoulder strength, upper trunk strength, right? If you push through your elbows, you have to lift your chest up. Your head is constantly being pushed to the floor in that position because gravity is a really mean older brother, just constantly trying to push us down, whether we're typically developing or have a medically complex history. And all of these things are great for medically complex kiddos, but they're also great for adults. Like if we're doing yoga, when we're in a cobra position, we're in tummy time. So some of these positions we think kiddos are maybe too old to practice, but the truth is they are universal. And so things like tummy time,
That's an
super
interesting
great, strengthening
perspective.
the whole back of the body. Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about me is I am not really great at like creating worlds for kids to live in or making up like a bunch of like different games. I feel like there's different types of pediatric physical therapists, and I'm definitely the goofy one. So I like to be silly with my kiddos, and I like to steal games from OTs that sound really cool. And
We all steal games from OTs. All PTs.
Oh, that's true. Those OTs got some solid
I do.
games.
Very good at that.
But I feel like because I started in an ortho world, biomechanics is something that I super love. And that's really kind of my superpower in a way, is like, again, breaking down that movement and trying to piece it together so that families feel like it is doable, but also that they understand the importance of it. And hey, maybe, sitting or, standing or walking needs different equipment to help us do that. Or maybe, like you said, your son began sitting, was it sitting independently or sitting with support at 6?
Oh, independently for like 15 to 20 seconds at a time. Like that's, and that's fine. That's the level he got to.
Which is amazing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And part of that is that acceptance. And like I want to add what you're talking about with rolling and tummy time. For medically complex kids, my son had a trach and a ventilator. And so there's, especially if your kiddo has a trach, there's always like this fear that the trach comes out. So once you're really comfortable and well trained, trach trained, you can stick it back in if it comes out, but there's ways to do it safely. And so a lot of families feel, even like my job is a pediatric physical therapist. And even with that, and I had been a therapist for a very long time by the time he came. I mean, a long time, not very long time. And that was still scary for me, putting him on his stomach or rolling. And his PT, who would come in, would be like, no, he can do this. And she would teach me, even though I knew how to do it to the kids in the hospital, when it's your own kid, it's just totally different. It's like you forget everything. And she would come in and she'd be like, this is how we safely put him on his tummy. He needs to be here for this amount of time. This is how we safely roll him. And we would just problem solve through it. And so I just want to encourage families who do have kiddos. You're like, well, my kid's on a vent, so I can't do that. You can, if you prop under his arms, or we had a Bavona trach. And so it was flexible. But a lot of times if they're on a vent, the little connector piece onto the trach is flexible. So there's ways you can do it. And I would hold, for people that aren't watching, I'm making a V, and like I'm putting my fingers on either side of the phalange of the trach. And you just hold that in while they're doing their stuff. And just kind of experiment a little bit with that. If you've got a kiddo like that, experiment with moving them in different ways, kind of holding that trach in place with your fingers over the trach phalanges. I don't know if I'm saying that right. An RT is going to correct me. Please do.
Yeah.
But just, I want people to have the confidence that their baby doesn't have to stay on their back just because they have a trach and a vent. You know what I mean? That it's really good for their pulmonary function to be able to move them in different ways, and for their ribs to mobilize by rolling onto our sides, rolling onto our belly. So anyway, just wanted to add that in there.
No, and I had a kiddo who, and kind of doing a full circle back to the original question, which was how do we help families piece together these little things so that we can have big gains, right? Eventually. I had a little who I evaluated her, and she was a little over a year at that point. And she was sitting independently, but like not able to tolerate being on her belly and not able to roll because she was on a ventilator 24/7 with a trach. And so they had a mobile device for the ventilator. So we would put her on that during therapy sessions. Um, but she really, so when you're sitting independently, you're basically like a block against gravity, right? So sitting independently, you have multiple types. And I was so excited that she was sitting, right? Because that shows some level of core strength to be able to keep yourself upright as gravity is trying to push you forward, push you back, or side to side. Um, but what some parents aren't always read into with sitting is that we also need to be able to move in different planes. So this is why I feel like rolling is so important, whether you get rolling by the time they're 6 months, or if you just keep rolling in your back pocket to continue to try to introduce it, because rolling works on the rotational or transverse plane. So for those of you on the podcast and can't see me right now, think of like holding a pizza out in front of you and you're sitting in a chair and your feet are facing forward and you go to turn and give the piece of pizza to someone behind you, right? Your shoulders are now facing in a different direction than your knees. So your upper half of your body is, if you go to your right, is going into right rotation, and the lower half of your body is facing straight. Now, if you go to the left, your upper body is going in left rotation. And rotation is really important because that's how babies roll, but that's also how babies go from sitting to all fours into crawling. And if you struggle with tummy time, it's going to be much harder to go into all fours because you're going from your elbow and your shoulder. So your elbow's on the ground in tummy time. So you just have your shoulder that's having to hold yourself in that position and contract, to all fours, which you have extended elbows. And so you have to go from a one joint control in tummy time to a three joint control in all fours. And three joints to control require so much more muscle strength than one joint. So while obviously with medically complex kiddos, especially kiddos with trachs and ventilators and all of this stuff, and even as a pediatric PT, like it's still intimidating, right? To go in, especially if you don't have a ton of experience with kiddos on ventilators. I always just defer to the parent. I always just tried to be calm. They were always there with me, obviously, to help reattach things or to be like, hey, let's move this to the other side if we're going to roll this way. And then I would always ask before, right? Like, okay, if I was confused, because sometimes I'm like the girl who, if I was a surgeon, I would be the reason why they X the leg that they're supposed to have surgery on. So sometimes flipping
Amputating
images
the
in my
wrong leg.
mind. Yeah,
This is
right.
why we're not surgeons, right here, both of us.
Right, 100%. But so she was one, right, a little over one, and she was sitting independently, and she really struggles with tummy time because, again, if you have a trach, extending your head is stretching all that tissue there. And that cannot be comfortable for a little or really anybody, right? But we need to make sure that we are at least introducing it in ways that they can start to build that tolerance, even if it's 5 seconds at first. 5 seconds, shows discomfort. 1, 2, 3, all done. You're showing the kiddo that you acknowledge that they're struggling and that it's not a preferred position, but you're also showing them like, hey, this is a hard thing we have to do. We're going to do it together. I'm going to let you know. 1, 2, 3, all done. That once I get to 3 over time, they will start to recognize, like, once you start counting, that there is a period of time that we're going to push towards that level of tolerance, but then we're going to cut it off. And so
Yeah.
just introducing that and even believing in the value of 5 seconds can be life-changing for families, because sometimes they're like, well, if they can't tolerate it, I'm not gonna do it. And the not doing of it has its own level of consequences versus if you did it for a literally itsy bitsy, almost inconceivable small amount of time, but you did it frequently. You might start seeing like this little went from like 5-10 seconds in tummy time to being able to roll independently, side to side. And then she went on to crawling, and then we went on to tall knees, and then we went into sitting to standing, and then we went into pull to stand. And then she's now, mom just sent me. So it was a year of therapy with her in May, or April. And I stopped seeing her in May because we ended up moving. I miss her. And so now we're in December. Mom just sent me a bunch of videos of her taking independent steps. So that all started though because we didn't give up on some of those building block movement patterns, because if she didn't develop or pay attention to rolling, we could have struggled with upper and lower trunk rotation, which could have blocked her from crawling, which could have blocked her from not having the strength in her hips that she needed for the next level of supported standing and eventually walking. And mom did like amazing, right? So they did their exercises every single time. Actually, that's probably a lie. They probably skipped a bunch of them. Let's be
Well,
honest.
because everybody
But
does. Yeah.
right. But she was intentional, and she was literally next to me the whole therapy session. We talked about every exercise. She really asked questions about why those were important, and I tried to explain every single thing for her so that she could see how it all fit together, because it does. Rolling fits into crawling, fits into strengthening the core for dynamic sitting. Sitting fits into core strengthening, like going from the back to sitting, develops the side to side, or the I'm a little teapot plane, which then helps with crawling or being able to stand. And all of it can fit together. But it's also okay if we jump around a little bit, because medically complex kiddos don't necessarily have the same path or journey or experience as typically developing kiddos do.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd like to add, to validate families that are out there that like my son, like he could roll from his stomach to his back, but that's all the rolling. He passed away when he was 8, and that's all the rolling he ever did. And so all this isn't to say that if you only do this well enough, you too can get to tall kneeling or standing, that sort of stuff. Yeah. That wherever your child is, just, taking those little things, breaking them down. And even if all they do is roll from their belly to their back by the time they're 8, that's okay. That's their path, and their path is okay and valid, and all of that. But I do think it's really good how you're empowering families to see, because we have this knowledge, right? And we know how things fit together, and we know the reason the sequence is the way it is. But a lot of us don't empower the families as much to really explain the intricacies of, like you're talking about, the different planes and the different movements. One thing that you touched on there is you mentioned when you said, counting to 5. One of the things you talked about is making sure, assuming children can understand you. One of the things, when I was working in the ICU as a young therapist, I remember being taught by another older therapist that you never talk over a patient in the bed, because even though they're in a coma or a medically induced coma or whatever it may be, you never assume that they can't hear you. And that really stuck with me. And then when I had my own child who was in the ICU, I always made sure to have conversations that were maybe not, that were difficult, conversations with physicians that were difficult, prognosis or whatever. I would make sure to move that physician to a different part of the room to talk, because my son couldn't speak, I didn't know what he understood or what he didn't understand. I knew he understood a lot, but I didn't know exactly what. So I think, seeing the value of that person and making the assumption that, yes, they can understand 5 seconds. And maybe for that child, they can understand the pattern of the sounds when you get to 5. Okay, I've counted to 5 for you 50 times over these past few weeks. Now you understand the pattern and my inflection and stuff. When I get to 5, it's over. But I love that, bringing the dignity of that person into letting them participate, even if they're nonverbal, even if they look, on the outside like they don't know what's going on, kind of affirming their dignity.
And I think I'm a pretty spiritual person. I feel like there's just so much about the human experience that we don't know, can't know. And I always default to okay, even if it's a 3-month old, typically developing infant who has a struggle with torticollis, I'm going to talk to them like they can understand me, like I am honoring their experience the same way that I'm going to talk to a kiddo who isn't showing me eye contact, isn't really giving me signs that they're per se engaged with what we're doing. Because at the end of my life, if I learn more about the human experience than I knew here, I would always want to default to just honoring the exchange that we're having, right? So things that I think it makes the therapy session go smoother. It's not always smooth, trust me. I get frustrated or don't understand certain experiences too. But things like telling babies specifically, your body is safe. I understand that this is hard. I mean, you could use this for older medically complex kiddos too. Think of their experience. They are having surgeries. They are having lines put in. They're having all of these things that probably feel uncomfortable, terrible, tough. And it probably at times feels like their body is not a safe place to be. So just reiterating, I know that this is hard. I know that this is tough. I know that experience of muscle burning or the other medically complex things are uncomfortable. But your body, you are in a safe place here. Your body is safe. Other things I love to do is especially if a kiddo has visual, has vision, isn't blind or doesn't have low vision, I like to show them my hands. If they are having a really tough time, sometimes it can be due to just tactile overload. So if they're struggling, I'll stop and I'll just be 1, 2, 3, all done. And then I will show them my hands. My hands are not on your body right now. We're going to do a break. And things
I love
like that
so
can
much.
just help the exchange a little bit. I acknowledge that I am placing body parts on you that you then cannot necessarily control or influence maybe in the way you want to. I want you to know that you can trust this experience together.
That's so beautiful. And just upholding the dignity of that human, whether they're 3 months old or always kind of joke that I'm the queen of one-sided conversations, because most of my children that I treat are nonverbal, but we talk the entire time. Yeah. But really, it's not a one-sided conversation. What I mean is that I talk a lot, come in.
Yeah, I think that's why we get along so well.
Right. I just come in and we just have conversations. And, if it's appropriate to the exercise we're doing, I'm always saying, okay, now we're going to do this. And now we're going to, and I kind of walk them through everything. But looking at their nonverbal communication, there's so much communicating that goes on with kiddos who are profoundly disabled or medically complex or nonverbal, there's so much communication. I'm sure with the babies too, that you see of like the squirming or the grimacing or
Hmm.
looking at you or not looking at you, that you can glean from that. And I feel like that's one of the things that I think is really important for people, just the general public, to know about any person with any disability is, people would come up and when I had my son and they would look at me and like ask me things about him, like as if he weren't there. And so I would redirect their eyes by looking at him and then kind of answering for him, like his kind of being his mouth, and then inviting them,
Right.
like you're like, feel free to talk to him. He loves to talk to him. Feel free to touch his hand, because people want to connect, but they don't know how to connect. And so
Yeah.
anyway, these little lessons of kind of that we're sharing here, hopefully will help people.
Well, and I think it's so important to like, I mean, I'm sharing all of the things I do in a therapy session, but I will also be the first one to admit that like in a non-therapy session, sometimes it is hard, right? You want to like respect the family. You also don't want to like go up and touch a kiddo that is a stranger. You want
Mhm.
to try to have a compassionate exchange. You don't want to stare, but you still want to give eye contact. Like there is a dance, a social dance that is happening. And I think as long as we're brave enough to have the conversation, so even if you do go up and talk to the mom and she redirects you to the child, I think it's okay to make that mistake, because over time it's going to become more natural for you to direct your conversations just to the kiddo, or
Yeah.
to the kiddo and the mom in equal parts at the beginning.
Mhm.
um but
Well, and not everybody, I mean, I was purposefully very open to
yeah,
people talking to him and touching him, but not everybody is. And
right,
so it's probably a safe thing, the mom coming up and, if you're unsure and you're in this situation that it's appropriate, coming up and being like, hi, would it be okay if I speak to your child? Because they are a child after all, right? I don't want people coming
right.
up and just talking to my 8-year-old and be like, what are you doing, creeper? Get out of here. So
I know. I
it,
have to
it
remember
is,
that sometimes when I'm like in a store or whatever and a kiddo's like doing stuff, like I'm so open. Like my default will be like, oh hi friend, or oh excuse me friend.
I
Like,
know. They don't know
because
you're a
it's
pediatric therapist, and all day
they
long
don't,
you're
yeah.
like, "Hi, friend. I'm so happy to see you. What's your
Do you
favorite
want to be friends with
color?" You start singing Miss
me? I
Rachel, and
know.
the mom's like, "Are you trying to abduct my child?" Like, "Oh, no, no. I just speak
Right.
to children all day long. Sorry about that."
Yeah. Yeah.
So, one of the things you've done in your life is you were also a school-based therapist,
Hmm.
which is fascinating. That's the one kind of area I haven't worked in pediatrics. So
Yeah.
you started telling me a story about an IEP meeting and how this communication with the parent um, just went really well. Do you know the one I'm referring to?
Yeah. So is this the one with the little who wasn't walking?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, okay, cool. Yeah, so we have this little she was in kindergarten and um she had some verbal words but was mostly nonverbal. I would, if I had to give a percentage, I would say about 80% of her experience was gestures and nonverbal exchanges. And she wasn't really interested in using a communication device. She wasn't really interested in walking. She could crawl around on the classroom floor, but crawling is not always a safe option outside of the classroom. She could pull to stand and cruise and was developmentally appropriate to take a couple of steps. But again, like that Grand Canyon analogy, walking for her was just too big of a leap for whatever reason, whether it was a visual orientation, whether it would, for her experience, felt strength based, balance based, whether it just was like, hey, right now I'm not necessarily fully able to get my needs met because my verbal exchanges aren't maybe as effective as they could obviously be. I feel like that was a little not how I intended it. But basically saying
That's fine. This is a safe place. We have to be able to have conversations. We have to be able to say stuff. I don't think that was a mistake, but we have to be able to say stuff and not worry about offending everybody in the world, because then no conversations will ever happen.
Yeah. So it just felt like to me that while she was safe, she didn't feel safe enough to take that next gross motor leap. And so I kept thinking like, okay, well, what could we do to bridge that gap? Because every time she left the classroom, she was in an adaptive stroller, which adaptive strollers are amazing. But the one thing that they don't offer is an ability to move yourself down a hallway or from one location to another. Someone else is pushing you. It's more of a passive experience, which is completely appropriate in a lot of areas, but maybe not ideal for encouraging a little to independently move themselves in like more of a community setting. So I was just brainstorming all of these things. And in the school district, oftentimes there's like a room or a warehouse with just like a bunch of different equipment that children in the past have utilized that the school district owns. So I went over there and I was like, all right, what could we do? And there's a lot of different types of assistive equipment that children can use to walk, right? You could have a little bit of like a reverse walker. You could have a front push walker. You could have a cane. But what I settled on was a little pediatric manual wheelchair. And I picked that because sitting for her was really safe. So she felt safe in her push adaptive stroller. But what the wheelchair allowed was an ability for her to push herself or to move herself from point A to point B with supervision. And again, it was new to her, so she needed some support. But basically, I knew that she likely had the dexterity to learn how to push the wheelchair because she was crawling. And so she was getting strengthening through her hands from the force of the ground through your hand and through the hand into the ground. So those opposing forces create strength in the muscles in the inside of the hand, as well as up the chain from the shoulder, elbow, upper trunk. So I knew she would be able to sit and use her arms to push. I knew it would take a little bit of practice for her to do that, but I thought, hey, maybe if we can get her to feel safe about moving her body in a way outside of the classroom, maybe we can then bridge the gap into her being a little bit more comfortable with that next phase of movement. And honestly, it shocked me. And I love when this happens because I'm willing to go outside of the box for these families, but I don't always know what the outcome is going to be because that is oftentimes really dependent on the child.
Yeah, trial and error.
And truthfully, like there are limitations and sometimes there are things outside of our control and outside of the child's control that influence outcomes too. But basically what ended up happening was this little learned how to push herself from the classroom to the gym, from the classroom to the cafeteria with supervision. So she would go with her classmates. They would place her either in the back or in the front, so that she had enough space to move, and she needed a little bit of help with like turning and some of those more advanced skills. But she started getting excited about moving her body in a way that was outside of just the safe classroom experience. What also started happening was she started being able to improve the connections for her speech, again, with speech therapy's help, obviously. But that repetitive arm motion is bilateral coordination. And so it was requiring both halves of her brain to work together to build pathways through the corpus callosum, which is like the little, it's like a oval shaped part of the brain where the pathways go through and cross, because your right side of your brain controls the left half of your body, left half of your brain controls the right half of your body. So as you are moving both arms, you have to use both sides of your brain. Well, when you communicate, you also probably have to use both sides of your brain. I'm not a speech therapist, so I don't know like the full on connection there, but it was fascinating to me because that was an outcome that I wasn't anticipating that started to show growth, which I thought was so cool when you look at like, this kiddo on paper was not necessarily appropriate for a manual wheelchair. She wasn't paralyzed. She could crawl, so she could pull to stand. Like everything was pushing us more towards like a stander, a gait trainer, things like that. But it was just too overwhelming for her. She was comfortable in sitting. She can move her arms. All right, well, let's divert. Let's take a different path. And she started just building that confidence. And then when I would come in, we would work on strengthening that lower quarter. And so by the time she started being more independent, with taking steps in the classroom, with support, and with talking with the families, right? Like we want to make sure that they're on the same page with the things that we're trying to introduce with their children, right? So you want the teacher on board if you're school-based. You want any paraprofessionals on board. And then you also want to say, hey, mom and dad, like, is it okay? I'm kind of going a little bit out of the box here, but like, would it be okay with you if I tried out this piece of equipment? I think it could really help. And so by the end of the school year, we were actually looking at a letter of medical necessity for this child to get a manual pediatric wheelchair because it was still at that point the best option for community mobility for her because she was still working on walking. And the parents were like, well, if she's shown that she can push herself here, is that a better long-term community mobility option for her versus like the adaptive, more passive stroller? Obviously, there are
I love
points
that
at which
story.
they're going to use the stroller too.
Right. Yeah. If they're going somewhere along, but I love that story so much. And this is something that I am like really passionate about, is finding a way for every kid to move their body in space. And so for my son, I got him a power wheelchair, even though he would never be independent in the power wheelchair. It was so purposeful of developing his brain, developing, just that he had agenesis of the corpus callosum. So like, just like you said, Lauren, the corpus callosum is kind of like a little piece that holds together your right and left side of your brain. And agenesis means not forming. So it was like small. So his two sides of his brain didn't work very well together. Yeah. But finding the power wheelchair, and we even had to adapt the what is it? The little toggle
joystick.
Joystick. Yeah. Word finding. I need speech. We even had to adapt the joystick because the one that came on it was too heavy for him to move. So we got this like really, really light wood that kids use to build projects in school. And anyway, my brother made him a joystick. And but him, like you could see the connections that just from being able to move his body in space purposely, like I push this joystick and now my body is moving in space for the first time. Everything started to explode, like not his speech, but his nonverbal communication, his eye contact, everything got better. And so I think any way that parents and sometimes therapists aren't thinking about this stuff because we're thinking about 1,000 different things. And sometimes based on your experience, a therapist may not be thinking about this. So for parents to bring this up, like, can you help? Can we start to problem solve together? How can we help this child move their body in space? And like what you're talking about is perfect. I love so much that you did that. And we always see that, right? We always see that explosion of communication when they hit a motor milestone. A lot of times they'll hit speech milestones.
Yeah.
Or vice versa.
And I think too, like, especially now, there are so many different types of styles of movement. So even my kiddo who is walking right now short distances with a reverse walker, she's still on her ventilator. In the house, the parents actually got a large, and it's probably almost like 1.5 foot by 1.5 foot scooter. So it's like a plastic platform with little wheels on all four sides. I'm sure most people know what a scooter is, but in case you blacked out gym class from when you were in elementary school, it's like, yeah, it's those scooters. And so they are able to place her and her portable ventilator on that. And she uses her legs to basically do like bend each, what is it called? Like heel slides? I don't know. Like
two
I
pediatric
literally can't
therapists
think right now.
yeah, like she pulls
So
herself,
she's
sits
sitting,
forward and
she's
pulls
pulling herself
yeah,
with her heels, and her feet. So she's
she's gonna have
basically
jacked
scooting
hamstrings.
Around. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I had another kiddo who used a radio flyer scooter. And she had arthrogryposis. And so she actually didn't use her legs at all because she wasn't quite able to. And she used her trunk to move that. And she would basically like flex and extend or side bend like rapidly to shift her weight to move the scooter on the floor so that she could gain independent mobility. And some of these things are just being willing to experiment with kiddos to try to get them to have some level of control over themselves and their environment with help or without help, right? Like it's so
functional
empowering
mobility
for these littles.
Functional mobility is functional mobility, and it's not just walking. I feel like a lot of people are like, well, my kid's never going to walk. So, okay, so what? Let's figure out something else. And let's, I just think you have to have a kind of a therapist who is kind of daring and a parent or maybe a therapist who's a little crazy and a parent who's daring to try these different things and be like, this is going to sound crazy. Let's try this. And as long as they're moving their body in space, so what if it doesn't look like everybody else, and I don't know.
And you can refine stuff a little bit here and there over time, right? Like, especially with kiddos who are medically complex, is like, yes, we want symmetrical movement for it to be optimal. But like you said, movement is still best. And over time, you can do things, stretching, strengthening, to make those gaps come slightly closer together. But again, you have to kind of let the child in some ways dictate their own experience and be okay with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And be okay with, I think it's good to be informed about the developmental process and like how you're talking about empowering parents with information. This is what all this does, which I think you're so excellent at. And you have you have your books, but you also have so many free resources on YouTube that you just have a heart of educating and breaking down these really complex movements to help empower people. So I encourage everyone to go look at that. Like have this education basis and then also be, okay, I know this is the typical quote unquote, but if you have a medically complex kiddo or a kiddo who's developmentally delayed or whatever it may be, being okay with, okay, well, their crawling is not symmetrical like it's supposed to be or reciprocal but that's okay. They're able to get there. And yeah, we want to keep working on that because we want to work on strength and we want to prevent scoliosis in the future and, kind of decreasing the lung capacity and all of that, but also being okay with where you are now and just finding function and finding joy in whatever it is. So when my son would flip over to his back, there's joy in that. Okay, well, so what? You're 7 and you're just rolling, but it's a way you can move your body by yourself. So I love that.
No, and I think as physical therapists, it's so important for us to bring up the little itsy bitsy moments of growth for families because they are, especially if they have a complex kiddo, they are constantly being shown gaps. And actually, I feel like this book could even be helpful. It's more of a business book, but it might even be a helpful perspective shift for medically complex parents. But it's called The Gap and the Gain by Benjamin Hardy. And it's all about how you can focus on where you're at and what your goal is, or you can focus on like the processes and what you've gained along the way, and how oftentimes if you focus too much on the gap, it can be depressing and hard and a lot of things. And you want to know where that marker is, right? You want to know where the milestone is that you're working towards, or that goal on your IEP, or the like goal for your outpatient therapist. And, especially if you have a medically complex kiddo, you probably have like 40 goals that your child's actively working towards, which can feel like a lot. I mean, that's a lot of gaps, just like always around. And so I feel like it's so important for us as pediatric physical therapists and other therapists to really try to break down, like, okay, last week we were able to lift our head off of the ground in tummy time, or like, prone position. If your kiddo is like past infant level is what we would call it. It's literally still tummy time. But this week we're able to extend the chest, like, before our chest was really close to the floor. Now we're like 4 inches. Okay. That's amazing. That's a next step. That's working on mobility. That's working. He's pushing through his elbows to lift the chest. That allows him to lift his head higher. Now we can introduce looking in different directions because we have that baseline, the ability to lift up. Now we're going to introduce rotating, because if we can rotate, then we can interact with our environment. Maybe we can watch the dog move side to side. Maybe we can be interested in what our brothers or sisters are doing in the corner. But first, we made this gain. Now, 4 inches of lifting your chest off of the ground might feel super small, but we have to master that first before we can get to that bigger, more fancy pants milestone or goal that you're working on. But if no one brings your attention to that growth that happens week to week, or every couple weeks, or even session within the session, sometimes, like, oh my gosh, the little just, shifted their way forward and lifted their bum off the table. Like, do you know how big that is? Like, just being excited and bringing your excitement to these families' experiences, even in just such small, tiny increments, like, honestly, it makes the session more joyful for you as a therapist, but also it just helps train parents' perspectives on, like, hey, yes, there's still a lot of gaps, but we are making changes. If we can make little changes, we may be able to also make big changes.
Yeah, I love that so much. As a medical mom, it's so easy to fall into the trap of, I can't, he's not doing this, like all the things you can't do. Because I mean, that's basically your life. You go to doctor's appointments and you go to therapy appointments and then you go to sleep. Like that's what you do. And so at every appointment, there's a new problem that you're working on, right? Just like you said. So I think making that little shift, training for parents to really try to focus on that. And then for therapists to kind of train your own mind to look in those little increments is beautiful. If there's one last thing that you would like to leave today, something that you just feel like you want to let everybody know, talk about, what would it be?
I think that if you just spend all your time in therapy sessions believing that your child can achieve the next tiny itsy bitsy piece of movement, over time your child may really surprise you. I think that's one of the things that is one of my superpowers, is like, even in a medically complex kiddo, in a really, really tough situation, I focus so deeply on like what they're showing me they're capable of in that moment. And I just believe to the absolute core of my being that we can just take that next itsy bitsy step, whether it's holding all fours for 5 more seconds, whether it's going from holding all fours for 15 seconds to shifting our weight to the left to lifting a hand with support. to going back to all fours and shifting the other side and lifting the hand, and I'm placing it forward and I'm shifting them. And then eventually over time, I just believe so strongly in that next little micro movement that children just surprise me, right? I try so hard to keep my bias and my fears of their eventual potential to myself and locked so deep down that I don't even look at it, right? Because parents will ask, like, do you think that they'll ever be able to walk? And I am like, honestly, that's such a tough conversation. There is, to be realistic, there is potential that doesn't happen. But at the same time, like, let's spend all our effort just on this next little thing and just keep focusing our attention there. And let's let those bigger questions, if we can, just pause for as long as we can, right? Eventually we have to add in things like, standers and walkers and things like that, but let's keep focusing on using that adaptive equipment to enhance that next little step. And I just feel like it changes the kiddos experience with you. And it, like, one time I had a grandma ask, like, why is my granddaughter show up so much more for you than it seems like she does for other therapists? And I sat on that and I literally thought about it for a whole week before I saw them again. And I was like, I think she knows, I believe that she can handle the next step, and I'm going to be with her every single step of the way to try to get there.
That's so beautiful. I
I'm going to
love your
cry.
perspective. We're all crying now.
I
You have such
don't
you have
know,
such a
like,
powerful perspective in that. And I mean, if I'm
yeah.
honest, I haven't thought about that as deeply ever that I have in this last hour. Like I love that so much. So I'm gonna put all your links in the bio. I want everyone to go look at all the links, your YouTube that you have so much free information on, your Pinterest, your
Yeah, and one thing we
Instagram.
didn't talk about today, if you have a kiddo with low vision, there's a couple of techniques that I learned from a vision therapist that I super love. Those are on the
Yeah.
channel. And
On
I
your
do have a
YouTube
couple of
channel.
other videos. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I talk a little bit about like a little room, which I feel like is a really cool experience, and show some like DIY versions. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's like the hand under hand technique that I even use for infants and individuals who aren't low vision. But I do feel like for medically complex parents, that can be a technique that might be new, because oftentimes it's taught to parents with kiddos of low vision, but maybe not parents of kiddos with complex conditions that have normal vision. And so I still feel like it's a great technique to utilize for them. And then I do have a couple of other just different ideas for complex kiddos. But I also, if there is something that you're looking for resource wise, I will also say for parents of medically complex kiddos, pediatric physical therapy exercises is another YouTuber on YouTube, and she has more videos for the medically complex patient population. So that would be another great resource for your listeners.
I'm gonna write that down. And then, so we talked about this before we started the show. I had 3 children. Dominic, my medically complex kiddo, was my 4th. And then I had another child after him who was typically developing. And I remember being at the pediatrician's office, and I think my 5th kiddo, my one after Dominic, was, I don't know, like he was little, like 3 or 6 months. And the pediatrician goes, I'm not going to bore you with going through everything because this is your 5th kid. And I was like, no, I don't know anything, because I had been living so long in the medically complex world with my son. And I'm a pediatric PT, right? My job
Right.
is to be a developmental expert. My job is to, and I know all of that, right? In my job when I'm looking at a client. But with my own kids, it's always a little more difficult. And so anybody who has a medically complex kiddo, and then, they can learned so much from you also. But then you go on to have a typically developing kiddo after that. You are an excellent resource for that, to remind you of what typical is, because typical is not, I don't know. I got our typical with our medical kiddos. That's not typical. It's our typical, but it's not typical. So I think going back, if you have another kiddo and just kind of relearning all of this stuff, it's a really good idea. It'll help empower you as a parent, being able to look for stuff and just to be overall a more educated human. And if I do that, and this is my degree and my whole job, then everyone can go do that. Don't feel bad about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, once again, I love talking to you. I love all the resources you put out. You put so much work into putting together these books and these YouTube videos and these courses, and they're so beneficial. So thank you so much for that work that you do, and look forward to talking to you again. I'll put all your links in the bio, so everyone please go and check that out.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to connect with your listeners, and I just love the work that you're doing too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Complex Conversations. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please share this episode and the show itself with your friends who you feel like could benefit from it. And please hit that subscribe or follow button. That'll really help us out. Head on over to bluebeecollective.com to learn all about the brand new Blue Bee community. This is a community where we're going to be bringing together parents and caregivers of medically complex children with complex care providers. The goal is to build up an empowered and fierce complex community to help you live your very best life. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you're doing great.